rightfully so, holding mayors like me accountable, holding police officers accountable, local governments, and seeing change at the local, state, and national level. And so when I think about a community like Springfield, the fact that even in the middle of this pandemic, we saw a police commissioner and a mayor try to reinstate a number of white officers that brutally beat men of color outside of a bar. And then months later, fire an officer of color for posting a Black Lives Matter graphic on their Instagram. Something isn't consistent. And so, when I look at my record as mayor over the last 9 years, and the Holyoke Police Department, I'm the first to say, hasn't been immune to many of these challenges. But what I am happy that we've been able to do is, number one, demilitarize our police department and reallocate any SWAT vehicles into community policing equipment in the city. 50% of the officers we've hired over the last 9 years are African American or Latino that live in the city of Holyoke, reflect the diversity of our community. In my 9 years as mayor, not a single officer has had to fire their weapon because we've invested in de-escalation training, we've invested in implicit bias in the community, and we've made sure that our police department is seen as partners. And we've also, when I took office, we had the highest out-of-school suspension rates in the entire country for students of color, and so perpetuating the school-to-prison pipeline. And by investing in restorative justice programming in middle schools and in our high schools, really our student leaders have taken the lead and have directly impacted that data. And so when I think about the future of police in this country, obviously there's a number of reforms that need to happen on the local level, but we also need federal support. We need to end cash bail, qualified immunity, other reforms as well. And so policing, for me, the future is when we think about domestic violence, when we think about mental illness, addiction, poverty, we live in a country that so often criminalizes every one of those forces in our lives. We criminalize addiction, we criminalize mental illness, we criminalize poverty and homelessness, rather than making investments in programs that will actually change people's lives. So when we think of policing, I don't necessarily agree and think that a uniformed police officer or an officer in general should be the first response to those challenges in our community. And so that's sort of when I support reallocating resources to programming like education, like investment, like healthcare, that actually would change outcomes and change our community in the long run.
Thank you. Next, as we know, people of color have been hit hardest by the economic downturn caused by the pandemic. As of June, the unemployment rate in Springfield was 25.3%. What more should be done to support Americans who are out of work due to the pandemic? And what would you do to stimulate the economy in Springfield and beyond? Yeah,
this is a really critical question. And racism is embedded in every single one of our policy issues. I mean, when we think about Springfield, for example, Springfield, Massachusetts, the largest city in this district, is the asthma capital of our entire country. When you think about being a majority minority community, and think about communities of color, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, the public schools that you study in, the public housing that folks live in, we as a government have divested from those very resources that people rely on each and every day. And when you think that we have a federal government where over 60% of our federal budget goes to the Pentagon, goes to war and defense, and that we have a member of Congress, this isn't just Republican and Democrat. Democrats like Congressman Neal have been voting for defense authorization budgets that send billions of dollars to war and defense. And when it comes to public schools, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to transportation, we have pennies or we don't have resources to do it. And I heard the congressman talk about writing the CARES Act. And what I have a problem is that the CARES Act created a $500 billion slush fund for corporations. Meanwhile, there was this expectation that a one-time payment of $1,200 to the most vulnerable in our district and our community is enough. And I support monthly recurring payments of $2,000 to families here in the district and working people across the country. That's a bill that is supported by Senator Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, and Ed Markey. Unfortunately, Congressman Neal came out against that legislation. I also support Pramila Jayapal's Paycheck Guarantee Act that would provide for the salaries of Americans making up to $90,000 a year in the middle of this pandemic. And I'm also a vocal supporter of a universal basic income, particularly when you look at the racial wealth gap in this country, the fact that our country deliberately and intentionally barred Black Americans from buying homes in this country. And when you think about the fact that a transfer of a home is the biggest transfer of wealth in this country, we need to make sure that we actually are intentional about making up for our historical scars on our history and giving people wealth building opportunities today. And so when I think about the pandemic, I also think about healthcare. The fact that in this country, 40 million Americans have now lost their job. Millions of Americans have now lost their employer-based health insurance. I happen to believe that healthcare should be a fundamental human right. You shouldn't need a job to have quality healthcare. You shouldn't need to be rich to have quality healthcare. And yes, we're represented by one of the most powerful Democrats in Washington, but you would never know it when you look at outcomes in our community. The fact that right now we have hundreds of inpatient psychiatric beds closing, we have birthing centers closing in communities of color, we still have dozens of cities and towns without basic access to broadband internet. Springfield, again, the asthma capital of our country, the life expectancy of Black and brown women and men in Springfield is 20 years lower than their white counterparts just a few blocks away. I mean, again, so when we think about racism, and I think about the fact that just a few weeks ago, we declared police violence and racism a public health crisis. Yes, police violence, police brutality, but also our healthcare outcomes, our broken healthcare system is completely flawed, and it's playing out in the lives of everyday people in our district. And so when I think about this pandemic and the impact it's had, the fact that as a mayor, mayors around the country and residents have had to reckon with, if we close schools, how are our kids and families going to eat or access the internet? I mean, right now, the city, not the federal government, is providing months of free internet to families that don't have them at home, distributing thousands of laptops, tens of thousands of meals to our families. And so we've really been in the trenches as a community. But unfortunately, there was just a study out last week, 50% of Black-owned small businesses in this country have closed in the middle of this pandemic. And so this isn't about getting PPP money to country clubs in Longmeadow. This is about making sure that small businesses in Springfield and Holyoke, minority-owned, female-owned, have the support and help that they need. You shouldn't need to know somebody in the congressman's office to get the help that you need. You shouldn't have to have political connections to get the help you need. At the end of the day, we need a government that is open, accessible, and transparent to everybody, particularly those communities that have been robbed opportunities to build wealth throughout our generations.
Thank you. Lastly, I would like to ask you, do you support the Black Lives Matter movement, and what have you done to advance the cause of racial justice?
Yeah, and that's a incredibly important question today, and I'm oftentimes asked what I think the most important issue is and our biggest challenge as a country. And without a doubt, our biggest challenge as a country is the persistence of systemic racism in our institution, in public education, in our healthcare system, in our system of public safety, and we need to completely reimagine the way that we deliver services to our community. And number one, you need a member of Congress that can unequivocally say that Black Lives Matter, but also not do it in a performative way. That is more than marching in a white neighborhood with Black Lives Matter signs that aren't even made by Black-owned businesses. It's about supporting legislation that is actually responsive to the people in our community. It's signing on to Ayanna Pressley's BREATHE Act. It's borrowing federal funds from police departments that continue to use it to militarize their police departments. You know, here in Holyoke, I was proud to march with thousands of folks after the brutal murder by police of George Floyd, from City Hall to our police department, to implement the 8 Can't Wait strategies, to reform the use of force policies, to create a civilian commission to advise us on making recommendations around funding in our community. And so whether it's racial justice, immigrant justice, it's incredibly important that we implement policies on the local level. And I oftentimes say I'm running for Congress because we can make changes on the local level around racial and immigrant justice, on climate change, on public education, on the opioid epidemic. But if we don't have a strong federal partner, if we don't have a federal government and federal laws that actually empower communities like ours, then there's only so much we can do. When we have a congressman that has been there 32 years, a congressman that voted in favor of the 1994 crime bill that is largely responsible for our system of mass incarceration today. We have a member of Congress that still opposes the legalization of marijuana and supports the war on drugs, that has wrongly incarcerated countless Black and brown folks in this country for decades, who are still sitting in jail for things that rich white men are now making money off of. And so we need to reform our systems of commerce. We need to make sure that those folks armed by prohibition, armed by our broken criminal justice system, can now benefit from the legal use of marijuana in this country. And so that's what we're doing in Holyoke. But I want to go to Congress to fight to repeal qualified immunity, to end cash bail, to end mass incarceration, to make sure that our police departments aren't occupying armies in our streets, and invest in those things that will make the most difference in our communities.
Thank you, Mayor Morse, and thank you, Congressman Neal. We're going to go ahead and move into conversation with the candidates for the Hampden District Senate seat. And for those questions, I'm going to invite Pioneer Valley Project member Jamie Pozo to join us. And we're going to start with candidate Adam Gomez. Let me just connect Jamie in here. Okay, Jamie? You can go ahead.
Hi. So this question is for Adam.
Go ahead with the question.
Oh, thank you. So even as the third largest city in the Commonwealth, with several of the poorest zip codes in Massachusetts, Springfield's needs and interests aren't often prioritized when it comes to the policy making. What can you say about how you have shown what you are accountable to the vulnerable communities like Springfield? And how would you be accountable to us in Springfield if you were to be elected?
All right, thank you for the question. It's a really important question. By the way, you guys all look fabulous. Well, it's very, very, to be candid, I'm one of the premier voices in Western Massachusetts when it comes to holding people accountable. It is no secret that when our mayor was trying to invade South Congressional Church, when we were giving sanctuary to a woman, that me and my colleagues steadfast and was there 110%, which led to us passing sanctuary, which is known as the Welcoming Cities Ordinance. And also, you know, working with my colleagues on the city council, passing to ban facial recognition, which I helped co-author, and then also pushing for police body cameras. I know just so recently, my colleagues, we stood hand in hand and passed a resolution that was filed by Tracy Whitfield, supporting the Senate version of the police reforms that are right now in conference committee, which we know that the senator has voted against qualified immunity. And essentially a little bit to the qualified immunity piece is that people of color don't understand what qualified immunity is until people of color or people that have been involved with police brutality tries to get their day in court. Victims are forgotten about. Victims don't get their chance to tell their story because of qualified immunity, which I do support, you know, some of the versions of what the House is proposing right now in conference. I think that myself, I have been very transparent since I've been elected in 2015, and I look forward to not only being transparent with every single vote that I cast, but also the reasons why that I casted when it comes to the amendments. Also, because we know that the state Senate usually takes voice votes on majority of a lot of the business that they conduct within the chamber. I think that right now the Hampden District is looking for somebody that they can hold accountable, that's accountable to them. I am, you know, a 3-term Springfield City Council, and my background speaks for itself that I am the candidate of the people. And specifically when it comes to our immigrant communities and our Black and brown brothers and sisters and our refugee brothers and sisters, I think that, you know, we have to look at Springfield and the Hampden District in the lens that we are going to represent and really be attainable to all parts of the district and not just some parts of the district. And that's my answer.
Thank you. Now, as we know, people of colors have been hit the hardest by the economic downturn caused by the pandemic. As of June, the unemployment rate in Springfield was 25%. What more should be done to support Americans who are out of work due to the pandemic? And what would you do to stimulate the economic in Springfield and beyond?
Sorry, you got cut off. Can you repeat that again?
Sure. So you know how right now here in Springfield, it's 25% that of unemployment as of June. So the question was, well, what more should be done to support Americans who are out of work due to the pandemic? And what would you do to stimulate the economic here in Springfield and beyond?
Well, the fact of the matter is that in Springfield, specifically communities of color, that before the pandemic, their unemployment rate was already in double digits in the Black and the brown community. To say the least, that the pandemic has exacerbated those rates, and we know that now that the unemployment rate has skyrocketed. We know that businesses right now will no longer open. A lot of those federal monies that came through the CARES Act are not going to go to sole proprietors. We know that the loans, a lot of people were locked out of them. We know that the lifeblood of the Hampton District is our small businesses, which some folks did receive some money. Some CARES Act money that came through the city went to a couple of businesses. But realistically, in my district, there was a lack of funds when you look at how much money was given out. The poorest district in Massachusetts is 01107. It's down in the North End. And in the beginning of the first round, there was one restaurant that received it, and they only received $5,000, which was Latino's Kitchen. I think that right now, folks need to realize that we are trying to support as much as possible, but if we don't traditionally look into supporting our small businesses on the state level when it comes to these economic development dollars, and just really bring people to the table like the chambers of commerce to understand now that there's going to be another downward spiral, I believe, when it comes to small businesses, because already business have been struggling in the city of Springfield. And that was due to the fact that we believed and we thought that the casino was going to bring millions of people down to the city of Springfield, which we don't know if we were ahead of the curve or it just has not happened. Me and myself being a business owner, I opened the business before I was elected, and within 2 years, I had to shut my doors because of the shortcomings in downtown Springfield with the lack of resources. I know that we're trying to do what we can with the money that we have, but I know that we need somebody or someone to be able to continuously work forward so we can establish more when it comes to the Black Chamber of Commerce, and also programming that is in the Springfield, like E for All, which are starting that started in Holyoke and now expanded into Springfield, into the North End. We need to start thinking innovatively and moving forward and bringing mom and pop shops to the table and stop thinking that business as usual and the folks that are elected now really care and really want to spend money within our district.
Thank you.
We're going to move to, thank you, Springfield City Councilor Gomez. We're going to move to Senator Jim Welch. Let me find.
Hello.
1 second. Here we go. Okay, so you can go ahead, Jamie, and I'll put him into the video.
Wonderful, thank you. Hello, Jim. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent civil unrest in the Black Lives Matter movement has been front and center once again. Do you support the Black Lives Matter movement, and what have you done to advance the cause of racial justice?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you, everyone, Pioneer Valley Project and NAACP for putting this event together. I appreciate the time to come and talk a little bit with all of you. Yes, I support Black Lives Matter. I support the movement. I support the statement. I support what the belief and the mission is behind Black Lives Matter. I will say it certainly got crystallized for me even more, after George Floyd's murder, because to me, what was evidently clear in that video, one, you had one man murdering another one on TV or on video, but was very clear is George Floyd's life did not matter to that police officer or even to the other 4 police officers or 3 police officers. So yes, I support Black Lives Matter. I've participated mostly as a listener at different events in our district to support the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it be, marches or vigils or in West Springfield, students actually organized a march. So I participated in that as well. The best thing that I can do, I think, at this given moment, when it comes to advancing the message of Black Lives Matter is continuing to work on the issue of police reform. As we know, the Mass House and the Mass Senate both passed differing versions, similar but differing versions of the police reform. And for me, as a legislator and somebody who is in touch with the community and the community leaders on an everyday basis, I get feedback all the time in terms of, what type of policies would be beneficial. Sometimes, policies get put in place, but they're really just there for window dressing, if you will, sometimes. So continuing to work towards passing the current police reform legislation is one way to continue to support. Obviously, support the organizations in my community that are working on the front lines, like Martin Luther King Family Services, Springfield Neighborhood Housing Services, Fit Body and Soul. These are programs that I'm, been successful with my good friend, Representative Bud Williams over the past couple of years to bring funding directly back into the district to work on issues. Awake is another one, to work on issues that are important in our community, that people are actually working on the issues on the ground floor, on the ground level in the community, and building the trust. The police department needs to work, and police officers individually need to work to develop the trust in the community. And these organizations are organizations that have a proven track record of being able to bridge the gap, so to speak. And I will continue to do that. I think that's one of the most important jobs as a legislator, is being able to bring the resources back. Oftentimes when we're in Western Massachusetts, if we pass funding for a statewide initiative, if you will, by the time the money gets to Western Mass, it maybe isn't as much as it could or should have been. So I'm a big proponent. And like I said, I work very well with Representative Williams and Representative Tosado, Representative Gonzalez, bringing resources back to our community so we can get that money directly into the hands of those community organizations. Thank you.
Sorry, let me unmute myself. Sorry about that, guys. And so I have one question for you. So given the recent U.S. Department of Justice findings about the Springfield Police Department related to the excessive force by the Narcotic Bureau and officers fighting inaccurate police reports, what do you think is the most important in order for communities of color to build trust with the Springfield Police Department and with police departments in general? What is your position on defunding the police?
Well, it's a great question. And when I saw the question, one thing that stuck out to me was, in the question it says, what do communities of color need to do to form relationships with the police department? And I understand, obviously, it takes two sides to tango, so to speak, or two sides to dance. But I really do think that the onus and the burden, not the burden, but the responsibility of building that trust between the communities and the police department lies very heavily on our department. It is their responsibility to be in the community building those relationships. And we know that they try. We know that there are terrific, police officers that are doing great work in our community, but not all are doing the job that we are asking or expect them to do. Given the report from the Department of Justice, it was certainly more than eye-opening. It was tough to read, to see that our police department locally engages in procedures and follows procedures that aren't necessarily legal, if you will, or ethical at the same time, potentially. But I know that the Springfield Police Department as a whole would like to move forward and continue to build the relationships inside the communities, especially our communities of color. And we do need to support them. We need to, in terms of defunding the police, I think that's a catch-all question, and I do obviously feel as though that we need law enforcement in our communities. I don't necessarily feel as though every call that comes into the police station is best suited for a police officer to respond to, especially maybe something that deals somebody who's having a mental health episode, so to speak. We need to have de-escalation techniques in place and better identification. I know everybody's trying to do their job and trying to do it very well. But for each unique situation that comes up, and I use the example of someone who's maybe dealing with mental health issues, we need to look at the idea of having the first responder in those issues potentially be, a social worker or somebody who is, geared and trained and ready to be able to deal with a situation that has those difficult scenarios. So I don't believe in taking all the money away from the police. I believe in investing in training. I was able to secure money for the Springfield Police Department for the EPIC program last year in the budget, working with Rep. Bud Williams. And that program is designed to train officers to recognize the challenges that their colleagues are facing. So obviously the most direct example would be if two police officers are partners and they go out and they spend a lot of time together on their shift. This training program helps those officers identify, say, using their partner as an example, if their partner is going through a difficult time, if their partner is starting to develop tendencies that, we as a society don't expect a police officer to develop. So a lot of it will be there needs to be accountability amongst police officers, amongst the police departments. And I know that there's a lot of police officers that want to do that. We just need to work that much harder to get all of the police officers to get on board with that, because the way that policing is happening now, especially in our cities, things need to change, and relationships need to be built stronger and better than ever. And I think support police with the training that they need, but also understanding that every call is not necessarily the right situation for a police officer. When there's something happens and there's a disturbance or something happens, typically people call the police or call 911 or call the police station. And obviously a police officer is dispatched. And if that officer is not trained to handle a mental health episode, so to speak, trouble can ensue, and it can ensue very quickly. So I think we need to focus more on that as well, training and being honest with ourselves as a community that although everyone wants to have a police department respond when we're in trouble. But we also need to understand that not every call that goes into the police department is best suited for a police officer to respond to.
Thank you to Councilor Gomez and to Senator Welch. We're going to move into our conversation with the candidates for U.S. Senate. At this point, I'm going to pass it back to Bishop Swan, and we will first hear from Representative Joe Kennedy.
All right, thank you so much. Once again, this is one of the important seats, the U.S. Senate in our Commonwealth, and this question is for Congressman Joe Kennedy. As we know, we've been hit hard as people of color by this economic downturn in our nation caused by the pandemic. It's been said over and over again about the high unemployment rate here in the city of Springfield, being 25.3%. I'd venture to say that the unemployment rate among communities of color is higher than that. What more should be being done to support Americans who are out of work due to the pandemic? And what would you do to stimulate the economy here in Springfield and beyond from a position in the U.S. Senate?
Sure. Hello?
You're on. We can hear you.
Oh, great. I'm sorry, Bishop. I didn't catch that. I think there was a little mix up on my end. What was the, was that just the first question about stimulate the economy?
Yeah. So we were saying that the unemployment rate here in Springfield is 25% due to the pandemic. What would you do to stimulate the economy here in Springfield and beyond?
Bishop, thank you. And first off, let me just say to everybody, thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you and discuss these really critical issues for Pioneer Valley. So a couple of things that we need to do, both short-term and long-term. And this is the reason why I rolled out a Jobs and Justice initiative over now several months ago that details, one, the short-term surge of resources that is needed and necessary in order to make sure that we are able to get through the COVID crisis. So resources for contact tracing, for testing, for supply chains, to make sure we have enough test kits and PPE. But also a longer term structural reforms to make sure we are never as vulnerable to this crisis as we have been, as we were at this one. And that means building in that actually invests in minority-owned businesses that make sure that we are not nearly as vulnerable to major disruptions as this one. Bishop, as I know you're aware, we are at risk of losing over 3,600 restaurants across Massachusetts. We've seen small business revenue plummet for 42% since COVID-19 started, yet Amazon stock price went up by 60%, and we've seen record profits at Home Depot and Walmart. And so we risk here is literally the erosion of our main streets, our minority-owned businesses, if we are not deliberate and intentional about how we are to mitigate that impact. You've heard me tell this story, Bishop, of one of the visits that I made to a restaurant in Springfield, a delicious barbecue place, where the owner of this establishment, she had a very small area out front where she could put a table or two. She literally cut a hole in the wall to put in a takeout window so that she could keep her business afloat during COVID-19. So what do we need to do? We need to surge those resources up front for everything from things for restaurants, like funds for outdoor dining, heaters in the fall, picnic tables, umbrellas, seating. We need to have funds for renovation so that people can actually retrofit their floor space, whether it's a small business that makes it available for and functional through public health guidelines, or restaurants so that you can socially distance. You need to be able to surge resources like online web development so that businesses can be able to access new markets and be able to actually sell stuff online or many of them, if they didn't have the resources before, certainly don't have the resources to be able to invest in a major online digital platform. And then longer term, it's taking on the challenges that we see, particularly in minority-owned communities and minority-owned businesses, like access to capital, like the fact that for the $1 trillion that a federal government has made available for the Paycheck Protection Program, the fact that I visited literally dozens of businesses, and a number of them in Springfield, that didn't get PPP, didn't apply for it, didn't know about it, were denied, still waiting. And this is $1 trillion that was supposed to be directed directly into our communities to keep these businesses afloat. Nail salons, barbershops, finishing their final touch with, in Springfield just the other day, checked back in on Clarence, the owner of the place, who I've now visited twice, and he's still waiting for notification from the Paycheck Protection Program. That's why I've also co-sponsored another bill that gets away with the middleman and the banks and the lenders in there in the first place and just gives a direct paycheck to employees and funds to be able to make sure that businesses are able to function. So I think, again, two pieces here: the direct investment now to make sure that we are able to get through this crisis, funding for resiliency and additional funds for small businesses, and then the structural adjustments that are necessary for supply chains, for employment mechanisms, for workforce training, to be able to ensure that we are never as vulnerable to this crisis as we have been. Last piece, because I think this is critical, particularly for Springfield. Over half of the households in Springfield pay over a third of their income in rent. You cannot build wealth in a community if the vast majority of your income is just going right out the door for rent. And we need to take on those challenges as well if you're going to hope to grow economic activity and economic growth in a community.
Thank you, Congressman. You're aware of the Department of Justice report that came out on the city of Springfield. Two subsequent Boston Globe articles came out and called the Springfield Police Department one of the worst in the entire country. What needs to happen for trust to be developed between the community and the police? And what is your position on defunding the police?
So, Bishop, if I'm not mistaken, I was with you in the very parking lot where one of those incidents took place back about 3 months ago. And I think it's critical to understand that of the Obama Justice Department investigations of police departments that were carried on by a Trump administration, there was only one. All the other ones ended when Donald Trump took over. The one that persisted was of Springfield. And so this is a big problem. And so the question you ask is obviously the right one. What is needed and necessary, and what steps are needed and necessary in order to rebuild trust and confidence between the Springfield Police Department and the communities they serve? 1, accountability. 2, transparency. 3, and most critically, a willingness to actually listen to the community and the members that the police force intends to serve. To come out with a level of humility and say, hey, we need that confidence in order to keep our community safe and in order to be effective policing and engage in effective policing. What is it that we need to do in order to build that trust back? Additional accountability, again, and transparency, as I said, but things like additional civilian review and civilian input into the operations and management of the police department is certainly something that I think oftentimes has led to greater accountability and greater accountability with the communities that are served. And that's where I think that should start. With regards to your question about defunding the police, look, I think 100%, though everything needs to be on the table here, including police budgets. And I come at this, Bishop, as you know, a lot of the work that I've done is around, in Congress, has been around mental and behavioral health care. The largest providers of mental health care in our country, the 2 largest are the jails in Los Angeles and Chicago. You talk to the sheriffs in our state, the folks that run our jails, they'll tell you that between 80 and 90% of incarcerated individuals on any given night in Massachusetts are suffering from substance use disorder, mental illness, or both. We lock people up that are sick. And this is just one example of misappropriation, misallocation of resources, that rather than investing in early intervention, prevention, and treatment, we don't. People get sick. They end up in circumstances where, for some reason, our society says, hey, call the police. And people end up incarcerated who are suffering from healthcare issues, mental illness and addiction. That needs to change. And that overhaul has to happen. And that's just one example of the structural investment that needs to take place with regards to investment in economic opportunities, investment in wraparound services, in early childcare and housing that would have a drastic impact on incarceration rates.
The third question for you, Congressman, is Springfield, though it's the largest city in Western Massachusetts, it has 2 of the poorest zip codes in the Commonwealth. Oftentimes, the needs of Springfield are sometimes ignored by those on Beacon Hill, those in Congress, and those in other positions. How have you been accountable to vulnerable communities? And if elected to the U.S. Senate, how would you be accountable to a city like Springfield?
So, Bishop, great question. Look, this gets to the heart of the reason why I ran and why I got in this race in the first place. Because I don't think we have seen a strong representation in the Senate as we need to have, and I don't think without real, direct, intentional, and deliberate effort and advocacy for communities like Springfield, you're going to get there. And I'll give you two examples of this. One, I currently represent communities like Fall River and Taunton. That they are oftentimes left out and left behind for the policymaking decisions from Boston, which is why I've done things like come up with a regional economic development strategy for working with Congressman Bill Keating and David Cicilline to try to actually reinvigorate southeastern New England, not wait on investment from Boston, but to do this deliberately and intentionally. And we were working very closely to actually create new economic structures in an economic region with direct federal investment in the southeastern New England to actually leverage the different assets that are across state lines, modeled after a bit of what has been done for the Knowledge Corridor, which goes from Springfield down to Hartford, and trying to take advantage of some of the opportunities there. When I had the opportunity to give the State of the Union response to Donald Trump's first State of the Union, I did it in Fall River to highlight Fall River and the needs of a community like Fall River and the opportunities from communities like Fall River. If you get the attention, if we are able to shine the spotlight there, and if we are able to have a federal government that is going to fight for the communities like Fall River and the families in Fall River, as hard as we are willing to tout the innovation that we're seeing in Kendall Square. Second piece, just briefly here. I have been to Springfield over and over and over again. I think I'm coming out tomorrow. And it's going to be, I think, my third time there in the past week. That's the way I intend to make good on this promise. We have been in Springfield from the beginning. I was out there on my announcement weekend, and we have been back probably at least about a dozen times since. Because that's what you should expect from your senator. You should expect on-the-ground leadership. You should expect presence. You should expect a relationship with your senator. Because you cannot pretend to actually represent and lead a community like Springfield if you are not in Springfield, if you do not have a relationship and community with people in Springfield. You might be able to look at the economic tables and say, we spend too much money on rent, or there's not enough direct investment. Understand what's going on in your community. Ask people questions, listen to those answers, and fight for people. I've tried to show that over the course of this campaign, and that's the type of leadership I bring to the Senate.
Thank you, Congressman. This question is for Senator Ed Markey, and it is the same question that I just asked in terms of Springfield being the largest in Western Mass, oftentimes being forgotten about. Many times we say that politicians don't really regard anything that is west of 495 as part of the Commonwealth. And we often say, welcome to the Commonwealth of Boston. Senator Markey, how have you been accountable to vulnerable communities like Springfield? And if reelected, how will you be more accountable to a city like Springfield?
I'm actually still waiting for the senator he's in the Zoom, but I'm not seeing video and I'm not seeing audio. So we're gonna give it just 1 second. Again, we cannot see the senator and we cannot hear the senator. We see the laptop, but we do not see the senator. But yet we may need to repeat the question. Okay, I'm being told to hold on for just 1 second. Just waiting a moment for Senator Markey to join us.
Hello, Senator.
How you doing? Good evening.
All right, good to have you. Good to see you. I asked the question, you weren't on yet, so I'm going to repeat it for you. Welcome.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize to you. I so apologize.
No problem at all. No problem at all.
Thank you.
the city of Springfield is the largest in Western Massachusetts, but oftentimes we feel like politicians don't regard anything west of 495. Resources and other needs of the city seem to be ignored by those in power. How have you been accountable to vulnerable communities like Springfield, and if reelected to the Senate, how will you be more accountable to a city like Springfield?
Great. No, thank you so much. Thank you for that great question. Well, you know, I'm on the infrastructure committee, and when the Democrats are controlling the majority next year, which we will, and Joe Biden is president, we're going to do at least a $2 to $3 trillion infrastructure bill. And at the top of the list of priorities has to be the brain train legislation that I have introduced with Richie Neal. And that will be to ensure that we connect Springfield to all of the other economies, which are absolutely central to the long-term economic stability, strength, and growth of Springfield. We need at least, and that's what we've done in our legislation, we've inserted $5 billion per year in order to accomplish that goal. $5 billion. And I give you, my guarantee that once we do this level of funding, which we will, okay, that we're going to make sure that Springfield is at the top of the list in order to get the kinds of protections it's going to need, the kind of economic growth that will make the 21st century greater than the 20th century. And even when the TD Bank branch was closing, and I heard from Bud Williams, I heard from the other leaders in the community, Elizabeth Warren and I stepped up. We stepped up with Richie to make sure that they kept that branch open. Otherwise, we would have had thousands of people who would have been unbanked or had very great difficulty in having access to the banking system. So without, and let me just say this: there's a large Puerto Rican community out in Springfield as well. And once all of these incidents started hitting Puerto Rico, I had a summit in Springfield with the entire Puerto Rican community, just to make sure that they understood how hard I was going to partner with them in order to make sure they got the help which they needed. It's why, by the way, I voted against PROMESA, which is hollowing out Puerto Rico, forcing cutbacks in education, in healthcare, in all of their necessities, and in fact, pressuring families to leave Puerto Rico to come to Springfield because of that tremendous mistake, which is PROMESA, which is really hurting that community. So what I've tried to do during my time is to ensure that I partner with Richie, I partner with the leaders in the community to get the help, to get the assistance which they need. And let me also say this: one of the key issues right now is going to be the education of the children in Springfield. And I created a program called the E-Rate, the education rate. That's the program that puts the internet on the school desk of every child in Springfield, regardless of income. And right now, we're in the throes of an educational crisis in our country. We're not going to go back to normal in terms of education this year or next year. And kids are going to need the internet at home. 12 million children in America right now do not have the internet at home. So my $54 billion program, educational technology program. By the way, Springfield has received from my program $58 million to make sure the internet is on the desk of each child. And I am the leader in the Senate. I have the other 47 Democrats with me to get $4 billion to make sure every child has access to the internet at home. Because if they don't get it at home, it's going to be a homework gap that leads to a learning gap that leads to an opportunity gap for these kids. And these kids are just as good with technology as any kid from the suburbs. But the kids who are going to be left behind are poor, they're black, they're brown, they're immigrants. And so I'm the leader of that program. And I believe at this time, this is one of the central issues. Are we going to take care of every child in our country and their education? It will be a tragedy that we will pay a price for a generation if my bill is not adopted, the $4 billion. And I'm going to make sure that happens in the next month.
Senator, the top 10% of the nation economically has 77% of the wealth. This mainly consists of wealthy white men. We understand that because of that, many corporations have an inordinate amount of influence in our nation's elections. What will you do to ensure that our elections are not weighted in favor of the interests of wealthy white men?
Well, let's just start with this. Number one, we have to repeal all of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest. Number two, we have to repeal all of the Trump tax breaks, the trillions of dollars that went to people who were already doing well. We have to reclaim all of those trillions of dollars. When people say, oh, can we afford to help families with their healthcare, with their education? We know where the money is. The money is in the pockets of those already wealthy people who got these trillions of dollars in tax breaks. So I want on the floor of the Senate immediately, as soon as we get elected, the repeal of those tax cuts. That's how we have to begin to fund all of the other programs for everyone else. My father was a milkman for the Hood Milk Company. He drove a truck. The way I worked my way through college, I drove a truck for 4 years. That's how I made my way through college. So I know kids, I know families today, they're working even harder than my family worked. There were 3 boys in the family. My father was a truck driver. You know, there wasn't a lot of extra spare cash at the kitchen table for 3 boys to go to college. It's even harder today for people to be able to do that. And a lot of these kids we're talking about are black and brown, and they have extra burdens. So from my perspective, we have to say economic justice is on the table. I'll give you another stat, which is an incredible stat. 3 billionaires, just 3 billionaires in America control more wealth than the bottom 50 percentile of our population combined. 3 people control more wealth than the bottom 50 percentile combined. And a lot of those people live in Springfield. And now it's our turn to ensure that economic justice is on the table. It begins with those tax cuts, but it also begins with, if we need to, more deficit spending so that we're pouring the money into the hands of regular families, hardworking families all across our country, and that we have Medicare for all so that there's no co-pays, no out-of-pocket. That's what I'm leading with Bernie. That we have an infrastructure bill that creates millions of new jobs, and they go disproportionately to communities of color and to frontline communities. That's the way it should be. That's what the Green New Deal is all about, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I introduced into Congress. It's all about creating millions of jobs, and we actually say it in the legislation that will go to communities of color, that will go into the communities that have historically been excluded. And I guess I would just add, finally, that when you look at all of our laws, and you can go education, healthcare, economic, racial justice issues, you can see how structural it is. Even the Federal Housing Administration was just structurally racist after World War II. Loans to whites to move to the suburbs, no loans to African Americans to move to the suburbs. Okay, just absolutely structurally racist. And so we just have to admit it that the federal programs allowed for an aggregation of wealth in the white community that was denied to communities of color, and say from now on, we're going to intentionally say that is going to end. And I will add this, that we're going to make up for it intentionally. We're going to say, no, we're going to put those communities at the front of the line.
There has been a lot of civil unrest in our nation. Protests in the streets in the wake of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, others, George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement that really started after the murder of Trayvon Martin and gained steam after the murder of Mike Brown has been front and center again. There have been many evil things said about them by many folks in the public sphere. Do you support the Black Lives Matter movement? And then more specifically, what have you done to advance the cause of racial justice?
Well, after George Floyd's murder, Ayanna Pressley introduced into the House of Representatives the legislation to repeal qualified immunity. And I introduced the repeal in the United States Senate, along with Elizabeth Warren, to repeal qualified immunity so that we would be able to say to families across the country, there is going to be accountability. When a police officer murders or harms a family member, that family should be able to sue in order to have accountability. It is absurd that there is a judicial doctrine which protects guilty people from being made accountable to those families. So I stopped right there. And with Kamala Harris, our next vice president, 3 months ago, she and we introduced legislation that would give $2,000 per month per individual in America for as long as the pandemic lasts. So when she and we talked about this, we said we're going to ensure that, for example, a couple would receive $2,000 apiece, $4,000. If they had a child, it would be $6,000 a month. It's not their fault that they're unemployed. It's not their fault that they've lost their jobs. It's not their fault. It's the coronavirus. It's a criminally negligent president in the White House. It's a racist in the White House. Unemployment is at the same level as the Great Depression in Springfield right now. And we just have to say, we're going to give the help to those families most adversely affected. We call them essential workers, but now we can see who they are. They're just the people who can't Zoom to work. They're the ones who have to show up. They're the ones that have to take the risk of catching the coronavirus, spreading it to their family members. Well, we just have to end that. And I'll just add, because this goes back to when Ray Jordan and I started as state reps, me representing Malden and him Springfield. We had a vote in 1973 on whether or not we were going to create a black Senate seat in Boston. There were 5 state senators who were each like slicing out 20% of Roxbury and Mattapan and Dorchester, so there couldn't be a black state senator. So that is the time that I sided with the Republican governor who vetoed that bill. And all of the Republican legislators supported him. But then they needed a small handful of Democrats who were going to vote. And I was one of them to sustain that veto. And that's why Bill Owens, who was the first black state senator from Massachusetts ever, that's why he's endorsed me and done a video for me, because it goes back that far where I stood up to make sure that there would be accountability, representation for the community. And I'll just finish with this. Cory Booker and I have, first of all, Cory has a book on, as a bill he's introduced on reparations. And I think that's a long overdue conversation in America. So Cory and I, who is endorsing me in this race, have partnered on that. And on criminal justice, he has a bill, it's called the Next Step Act. He and I are the only 2 co-sponsors of it, but it's going to be the bill on the floor of the Senate next year because Cory's the leader. And I am the only other person with him on it, but it's going to just do away. It's going to overhaul the sentencing guidelines, 18 times higher sentencing in America for crack cocaine as for powdered cocaine. Powdered cocaine is a suburban drug. Crack cocaine is an inner city. That's why we have this crazy incarceration level in our country, because that's what gets prosecuted at a 18 times higher penalty. So Cory and I, we're going to go right through the entire litany of things that have gone wrong with our system to begin this debate over overhauling it. And I am quite confident that with a Biden presidency, we're going to be moving that very, very quickly next year. Just the system is broken. One final stat: we're 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the prisoners. That's crazy. We're 5% of the world's population. 1 in 3 women in the world who are behind bars in the United States. 1 in 3 in the world. We're only 5% of the world's population. We owe an apology to those people. African-American young men were incarcerated at a high rate because of our system, which at its core is just fundamentally broken. And I am working on each and every one of those issues, and I will be a leader, especially with Cory Booker on the floor of the United States Senate. And by the way, Rachel Rollins, the great district attorney of Suffolk County, has endorsed me as well because she knows that I am her partner in overhauling this criminal justice system.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate your answer to those questions. We're going to give you back in the hands of Tara Paris, and then I'll come back and close us out.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to thank all of the candidates for being with us, this evening. And it's a lot to take in. It's a lot of very intense issues that we've been talking about. We really appreciate the willingness of all the candidates to answer candidly. And, you know, before we close out, I just want to say on behalf of Pioneer Valley Project, and also the NAACP that, you know, we're here, we've been on the ground, we've been doing the work for racial and economic justice for years and years. And we in Springfield, whoever gets elected, we look forward to having access and conversation with every single elected official in either the state seat or the federal seat, as decided on September 1st. I think, as has been mentioned many times tonight, oftentimes Springfield feels as though we're not heard, that we're not considered as these decisions get made. And we want all of the candidates to know that we will hold you accountable. We're looking forward to working in partnership with you. And we expect you to fight for us here in Springfield. You know, when it comes to racial and economic justice issues, we are experiencing, even in a small city in Springfield, some of the same dynamics that are present in large cities across the country. And so we just want to make sure that it's clear as we, you know, conclude tonight that, you know, we are heard and that we are also a central part of the conversation here in the Commonwealth and across the country. So I'm going to go ahead and again, thank you to the candidates. Thank you to everyone on Facebook Live. Thank you to everybody here on Zoom for making the time. We are appreciative of getting to know our candidates a little bit better. And I'm going to, with that, going to pass back to Bishop Swan.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Reverend Lewis and the Pioneer Valley Project, to the executive members of the NAACP, to all of the participants that came on the Zoom and that are streaming live. Thank you. And thank you to all of the candidates. I do want to announce that this Thursday, August 27th, the NAACP will hold Together We Win Phase 2 Operation Vote. It will be a virtual voter education and census forum with several panelists: Gladys Oyola, our election commissioner, Bud Williams, Councilor Jesse Letterman, and Tracy Whitfield. That will take place streaming at 8:00 p.m. on Thursday, and we'd ask for you to join us. Look in the chat section. There's ways that you can get involved with the Pioneer Valley Project and join the NAACP. And most importantly, on Tuesday is the primary election. We need you to vote. We need you to bring people to the polls. If you have not sent your ballot in already, you can go to Greenleaf. You can go to City Hall. You can vote in person in early voting right now. We have a hashtag out there, hashtag collect your cousins. We need you to get everybody in your circle and get out there and vote, vote, vote. Thank you for your time this evening. May God bless you with a wonderful evening. Peace out to all of you all. Thank you all for tuning in.